The future of Bitcoin will not be decided by how high the price rises, but by when you realize that you have been looking at the wrong thing the entire time. And this is exactly where the problem begins. While millions of people look at charts every day, compare forecasts, and try to catch the perfect moment, a process is happening in the background that is far bigger than any price, any candle, and any short-term movement. A process that is not loud, not dramatic, and that is exactly why it is completely underestimated by most people. Most people believe they need to time Bitcoin correctly. They think it's about getting in early enough, buying cheap and selling later at a higher price. That sounds logical, but this exact way of thinking is why so many ultimately lose or never truly understand what is happening here. Because this perspective reduces Bitcoin to something it is not: an investment, a trade, a game within an existing system, and this is exactly where the biggest misconception begins. The interesting thing is, it's not just beginners who misunderstand Bitcoin. Quite the opposite. Often it is the most intelligent, rational, and successful people who struggle with it the most. Why? Because they are used to analyzing things based on existing models. They look at metrics, at comparative values, at historical developments, and that is exactly what does not work here. Because Bitcoin does not fit into any traditional valuation model. It has no cash flow, no profits, no management, and that is exactly why it appears intangible or even irrational to many. But the real problem is not Bitcoin. The problem is the perspective. Because if you try to evaluate something completely new with old rules, you will inevitably arrive at wrong conclusions. This is not a minor mistake in thinking. This is a mistake on a systemic level. And that is exactly why Bitcoin is so often underestimated. Almost everyone who studies Bitcoin for a longer time reaches a point where something shifts. A moment when things suddenly make sense that previously seemed contradictory. At first, you look at the price. You think in profits and losses, in entries and exits. But at some point you realize, this is only the surface. Some are still waiting, others have long understood that it was never about the price, never about the perfect entry, but about something that is decided much earlier, in the mind. And this very moment decides, and this is exactly where something crucial happens. You begin to no longer see just the asset, but the system behind it. Suddenly you start asking different questions. No longer, when should I buy? But why does this exist at all? No longer, how high can it go? But what makes it unique? And this is exactly where everything changes. Because Bitcoin is no longer speculative. Bitcoin becomes logical. While most people try to beat the market, something far more fundamental is happening. Something that is not visible at first glance. Something that does not show up in daily price movements. More and more people are starting to question the existing monetary system. Not because they suddenly became interested, but because they are forced to notice it. Inflation is no longer just a term from the news. It becomes real, tangible, in everyday life. Prices are rising, savings are losing purchasing power. Long-term planning becomes more difficult. And slowly, a feeling emerges that many cannot immediately name, a feeling of uncertainty. This feeling is crucial because it leads to a new question. No longer, how do I invest better? But instead, is the system I operate in even stable? And this is exactly where Bitcoin comes into play. Not as a quick profit, not as speculation, but as an alternative. Most people come to Bitcoin because of money. That is the entry point, the trigger. But that is not the reason why they stay. They stay because they begin to understand that money is not neutral, that money has rules, and that these rules are made by people. That also means these rules can be changed. And this is exactly where the crucial difference with Bitcoin lies. Bitcoin follows fixed rules, predictable, transparent, immutable. At first, this sounds technical, but the consequence of this is enormous. For the first time, a monetary system exists that does not depend on trust in people, but on mathematical rules. And that is exactly the point many underestimate. Because trust is the foundation of everything we call money. When this trust begins to crumble, people look for alternatives. And this is exactly where the true future of Bitcoin begins. There is a moment when your perspective changes permanently. A moment when you realize that Bitcoin is not simply better money, but something entirely different. You realize that it is not about improving the existing system, but about bypassing it. And this is exactly where it becomes uncomfortable for many. Because if Bitcoin works, it challenges fundamental assumptions about money, about control, about trust. And that is exactly why this topic is so rarely discussed openly. Not because it is irrelevant, but because it is too big. Up to this point, most people at least theoretically understand that Bitcoin is different. But what almost everyone underestimates is not Bitcoin itself, but how Bitcoin grows. And this is where one of the biggest differences to anything you know lies. Bitcoin is not a company. There is no CEO, no marketing department, no growth team. And yet it grows. Why? Because Bitcoin is not a product. Bitcoin is a network. And networks follow completely different rules than anything we are used to. English, if you build a company, it usually grows linearly. More employees leads to more output, leads to more revenue. But networks, they grow exponentially. That means, at the beginning, almost nothing happens. Everything seems slow, insignificant, almost irrelevant. And this is exactly where most people drop out, because they think nothing is happening, but beneath the surface, something is indeed happening, just not visible. More people are starting to engage with it. More developers are working on it. More infrastructure is being built. And most importantly, more people are beginning to understand it. And this is exactly where the crucial point comes in. A network does not become strong simply because it exists. A network becomes strong because people trust it. And this trust does not grow suddenly. It grows slowly. But once a certain point is reached, everything accelerates. Think about the internet. In the 90s, it was irrelevant for most people. Slow, impractical, incomprehensible. Many said, this will never take off. And they were wrong, not because they were stupid, but because they interpreted exponential growth as linear. And the exact same mistake is happening again today. With Bitcoin, most people look at the current state and think it's too small, too volatile, too uncertain. But this is exactly the point where major developments are always underestimated, because exponential growth always feels like stagnation at the beginning. And that is exactly why most people only recognize the turning point when it has long been passed. What is really happening with Bitcoin is not a price movement. It is a shift of trust, and that is far more powerful. People are slowly starting to trust Bitcoin more than traditional systems. Not completely, not immediately, but step by step. A small part of their wealth, a small part of their thinking, a small part of their trust. And that is exactly the beginning. Because once trust has shifted, it rarely returns completely. And this is where it becomes clear for the first time how deep this change really goes. It is not about Bitcoin performing better. It is about Bitcoin slowly becoming an alternative. And alternatives change systems. Not immediately, but inevitably. And this is exactly where the future of Bitcoin suddenly becomes personal. As long as Bitcoin is just a topic, everything remains comfortable. You can say, I'll just observe for now. I'll wait a bit longer. Maybe later. And that feels reasonable, controlled, rational. But that is exactly where the real danger lies. Because every major change feels optional at the beginning. The internet was optional. Smartphones were optional. Social media was optional. And Bitcoin, it still is today, but not forever. English, and this is exactly where everything separates. Some are still waiting. Others have long understood that it was never about the price, never about the perfect entry, but about something that is decided much earlier, in the mind. And this very moment decides